HOA Karen reported my barn remodel, didn't know it's a government training site. Entitled People the Leopard Print Nemesis, A Tale of HOA Karma Chapter 1, The Queen of Maplewood Heights. The morning sun cast long shadows across my property as I heard the familiar click-clack of heels on my gravel driveway. There she stood, Brenda Hutchinson, our HOA president, triumphantly positioned at the edge of my property line with her signature leopard print clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield of righteousness. Her phone was out, and she was snapping photos of my half-finished barn renovation with the enthusiasm of a tourist discovering the Grand Canyon for the first time. "Mr. Peterson," she called out in that shrill voice that could peel paint off a battleship, "I hope you know I've reported this unauthorized construction to the zoning authorities. They'll be here any minute to shut down your little project." She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just won the lottery, completely unaware that uniformed officials were indeed about to arrive, but not for the reason she thought. I leaned against my porch railing, coffee mug in hand, and watched her preen like a peacock displaying its feathers. If only she knew what was really happening here. But then again, Brenda Hutchinson never did bother with facts when assumptions suited her better. "My name is Jack Peterson, and I'm a retired Marine who served 3 tours in Afghanistan over the course of 20 years. The Corps taught me many things: discipline, honor, and most importantly, how to recognize a real enemy from a paper tiger." Brenda Hutchinson was definitely the latter, though she'd spent the last 5 years terrorizing Maplewood Heights like she was running her own personal military dictatorship. 6 months ago, I moved to this quiet suburb hoping for some peace after 2 decades of service. The old Garrett farm came up for sale, complete with a dilapidated barn that had seen better days since the Eisenhower administration. What attracted me wasn't just the property's potential, but a unique opportunity presented by my former commanding officer, Colonel Matthews, who had transitioned to civilian work with the Department of Homeland Security. The DHS was looking for discrete locations to establish tactical training facilities for first responders. Nothing flashy or obvious, just converted spaces where EMTs, firefighters, and police could train for disaster scenarios without drawing unnecessary attention. My barn, sitting on 5 acres of secluded land, was perfect. The permits were filed through federal channels, everything completely legal but intentionally kept low profile for security reasons. I should have known that in a neighborhood ruled by Brenda Hutchinson, nothing stays under the radar for long. From day one, she had it out for me, and I couldn't figure out why until my neighbor Tom Williams filled me in on the local politics. "She's been HOA president for 5 years, Tom explained over beers on his back porch. "Before that, she was just another suburban housewife with too much time on her hands. But give someone like Brenda a little power, and it goes straight to her head. She's fined every homeowner in this neighborhood at least once, some multiple times. The woman has a gift for finding violations that don't exist. Maybe it was because I didn't attend her mandatory welcome committee meeting, where she apparently spent 2 hours explaining the 47 different rules regarding acceptable mailbox colors. Or perhaps because I politely declined her suggestion to paint my mailbox periwinkle blue to match what she called the neighborhood aesthetic. Looking around at the hodgepodge of architectural styles in Maplewood Heights, I couldn't figure out what aesthetic she was referring to. The truth was, I'd dealt with actual dictators in Afghanistan, men with real power who could order executions with a nod. Brenda Hutchinson, with her leopard print accessories and suburban delusions of grandeur, didn't even register on my threat assessment scale. That would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. Chapter 2, The campaign begins. The construction began 3 weeks ago. Professional contractors arrived early, worked quietly, and cleaned up after themselves. We weren't building some monstrosity that would block anyone's view or create noise pollution. Just reinforcing the existing structure and adding some interior modifications for specialized training scenarios. To any casual observer, it looked like a simple barn restoration, the kind of project that should have been celebrated in a community that prided itself on property values. But Brenda wasn't a casual observer. She was a professional busybody with too much time and too little sense, armed with a smartphone and an inflated sense of authority that would have been comical if it weren't so destructive. By the end of the first week, she had started her campaign. It began with passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox about construction noise, even though we strictly adhered to the 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. schedule mandated by county ordinances. The notes were written on HOA letterhead, as if that gave them some official weight, and signed with a flourish that made her name look like a royal decree. "Dear Mr. Peterson," the first note read, "while we appreciate your efforts to improve your property, several neighbors have expressed concerns about the noise levels during construction. Please be mindful that this is a residential area where people work from home and deserve peace and quiet. Sincerely, Brenda Hutchinson, HOA President. I showed the note to my contractor, Mike Rodriguez, a guy who'd been building in this county for 15 years. He laughed so hard he nearly fell off his ladder. Jack, we've been quieter than a church mouse, he said, wiping tears from his eyes. I've worked construction sites next to hospitals that were louder than this. Your neighbor lady's got issues. The notes escalated quickly. By the second week, she was threatening to file noise complaints with the county, despite the fact that our work was well within legal limits. She started timing our activities with a stopwatch, documenting every hammer strike and power tool usage. I watched her from my kitchen window, sitting in a lawn chair at the edge of her property with a notebook, pencil, and that damned leopard print clipboard. Then came the visits from her flying monkeys, various HOA board members who would stop by to express concerns about property values. These people had clearly been coached by Brenda, delivering their messages with the uncomfortable air of hostages reading prepared statements. You know, Harold Simmons had said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously, Brenda thinks you might be violating the agricultural land use restrictions. She's done some research on the county website. Harold was a retired accountant who'd lived in the neighborhood for 12 years. He'd never shown any interest in agricultural land use restrictions before Brenda put him up to this visit. I invited him in for coffee and showed him the original survey documents that clearly established the property's mixed-use zoning. He left looking embarrassed and mumbling apologies, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Brenda had already poisoned the well. The next visitor was Margaret Foster, a grandmother who lived 3 houses down and had previously been nothing but friendly. She brought homemade cookies and a rehearsed speech about community standards. It's not that we don't want you here, Jack, she said, unable to meet my eyes. It's just that Brenda says large construction projects can affect everyone's property values. She's very knowledgeable about these things. I accepted the cookies graciously and walked Margaret around the construction site, explaining exactly what we were doing and why. She seemed relieved to learn it wasn't a commercial development or some kind of industrial operation. But when I asked if she'd share this information with Brenda, she just shook her head sadly. You don't understand, Jack. Brenda doesn't like to be wrong. It's easier to just go along with what she says. That's when I realized the true scope of the problem. Brenda hadn't just appointed herself HOA president, she'd created a climate of fear where reasonable people were afraid to challenge her decisions. It was a classic example of how petty tyranny operates, using social pressure and the threat of retaliation to maintain control. Chapter 3, The Escalation. By week 2, Brenda had escalated to official HOA violation notices. According to her interpretation of the bylaws, any structure over 500 square feet required HOA approval, even though the barn had been there for 50 years and I was simply renovating an existing structure. She'd found some obscure clause about substantial modifications and twisted it to fit her narrative. The violation notice arrived on official HOA letterhead, complete with legal-sounding language about potential enforcement actions and architectural review committee approval. The irony wasn't lost on me that the architectural review committee consisted of exactly 3 people: Brenda, her next-door neighbor who happened to be her best friend, and a retired librarian who'd been bullied into accepting the position. In Brenda's world, rules were apparently flexible when it came to her friends but carved in stone for everyone else. I'd noticed that her friend Janet had recently added a sunroom to her house without any public architectural review, and 2 board members had installed elaborate landscaping features that were clearly visible from the street. But somehow, my barn renovation was a threat to the community's character. She called an emergency HOA meeting, which I didn't attend out of principle. I'd read the bylaws carefully, and there was nothing in them that gave the HOA authority over structures that predated the association's existence. Plus, I had no intention of subjecting myself to what I knew would be a kangaroo court. According to my neighbor Tom, who did attend, Brenda spent 45 minutes presenting a PowerPoint presentation about the dangers of unauthorized construction. She'd titled it Protecting Our Community, the Slippery Slope of Unchecked Development, and had somehow stretched my barn renovation into a threat to the entire neighborhood's existence. The presentation included photos of my barn from every conceivable angle, some clearly taken from inside my property line, which constituted trespassing. She'd also included aerial shots that she'd apparently taken with a drone, though she'd failed to get the required FAA permissions for flight over private property. But who was counting legal violations when you were on a righteous crusade? "This is about the integrity of our community," she had declared dramatically, according to Tom's account. "If we allow one person to flagrantly violate our standards, where does it end? Today it's a barn. Tomorrow it could be a meth lab or a motorcycle repair shop." The fact that I was a decorated veteran with active security clearance apparently didn't factor into her meth lab theory. She'd also ignored the obvious question of why someone would build a meth lab in a 150-year-old barn on 5 acres of open land where every neighbor could see the activity. But Brenda was on a mission, and facts were just inconvenient obstacles to her narrative. Tom told me that several homeowners had tried to speak in my defense, pointing out that the construction was improving the property and had been consistently quiet and professional. But Brenda had shut them down with parliamentary procedure, claiming that only affected parties could speak during the comment period. "How exactly does she define affected parties?" I asked Tom. "Anyone who agrees with her, apparently," he replied with a bitter laugh. "Jack, I've lived here for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like this. She's turned the HOA into her personal weapon." Chapter 4. The investigation. Brenda's campaign against me reached new heights of absurdity when she began filing complaints with every government agency she could think of. She contacted the county zoning board, the building inspector, code enforcement, the health department, and even the local fire marshal. Each complaint was filled with dramatic language about unauthorized construction and potential safety hazards. She also called the local news station, Channel 7, trying to drum up a story about rogue construction in Maplewood Heights. The reporter who took her call was apparently professional enough to ask some basic questions about permits and zoning compliance, which Brenda couldn't answer because she'd never actually researched the legal requirements. The story never aired, but that didn't stop her from telling everyone that the media was investigating my project. The crowning achievement of her campaign was the creation of a neighborhood Facebook group called Concerned Citizens Against Illegal Barns. Despite its ridiculous name, the group somehow attracted 37 members, mostly people who enjoyed neighborhood drama and had no actual knowledge of construction law or zoning regulations. The Facebook group became Brenda's primary platform for sharing photos and updates about my illegal construction project. She posted daily updates with timestamps, weather conditions, and detailed descriptions of construction activities. It was like a nature documentary, but instead of studying wildlife, she was documenting my contractor's coffee breaks and lunch schedules. Day 12 of the illegal construction, one post read. 3 trucks arrived at 7:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the supposed 8 a.m. start time. This is clearly a violation of the noise ordinance. I've documented everything with photos and timestamps. The county will hear about this. The comments section became a breeding ground for neighborhood gossip and conspiracy theories. Someone suggested I might be building a compound for anti-government activities. Another person speculated that the barn was actually a front for some kind of illegal business operation. The most creative theory came from a woman who was convinced I was building a secret bunker to hide from the IRS. My favorite post came when Brenda announced that she'd purchased a surveillance drone to better monitor my property. She'd bought a $300 quadcopter from Amazon and somehow convinced herself that this made her an expert in aerial reconnaissance. The drone's maiden flight lasted exactly 12 minutes before she crashed it into Mrs. Chen's decorative bird bath, destroying both the drone and a ceramic fountain that had been in the Chen family for 3 generations. Mrs. Chen, a retired English teacher who'd always been diplomatic about neighborhood disputes, was not amused. She filed a complaint with the HOA about Brenda's reckless drone operation and demanded reimbursement for the destroyed bird bath. Brenda's response was to claim that Mrs. Chen's bird bath was an attractive nuisance that posed a hazard to aircraft. The drone incident marked a turning point in neighborhood opinion. Several people who'd been neutral or supportive of Brenda began to question her methods and motives. The Facebook group's membership started declining as people realized they'd signed up for Neighborhood Watch, not neighborhood warfare. Chapter 5. The morning of reckoning. Every morning, I would see Brenda's silver Lexus creep past my driveway, slowing down just enough for her to peer at the construction progress. She took more photos than a crime scene investigator, documenting every hammer strike and sawdust pile. She'd even started keeping a construction log, noting the arrival and departure times of every worker and vehicle. I began to find her surveillance routine almost comforting in its predictability. She'd arrive at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before work began, and position herself at the edge of my property line like a sentinel. She'd brought a folding chair and a small cooler, turning her surveillance into an all-day affair. Sometimes she'd bring her friend Janet, and they'd sit together commenting on the work like sports broadcasters. My contractors had initially been annoyed by her presence, but eventually they started treating her like neighborhood entertainment. Mike Rodriguez began giving her a friendly wave every morning, and his crew would sometimes perform exaggerated safety demonstrations for her benefit. They knew she was documenting everything, so they made sure to follow every protocol to the letter. "Your neighbor lady's got dedication," Mike told me one afternoon. "I've been doing construction for 15 years, and I've never had someone document my work this thoroughly. She's got more photos of this project than I do." The irony was that Brenda's obsessive documentation was actually helping my cause. Every photo she took showed professional, safe, and legal construction practices. Every timestamp proved that we were following all noise ordinances and work schedule requirements. She was essentially creating a comprehensive record of our compliance with all applicable regulations. But Brenda was convinced that she was building a case against me, and she was eagerly waiting for the moment when the authorities would vindicate her crusade. She'd been telling everyone who would listen that the zoning board was going to shut down my project and that I'd probably face criminal charges for unauthorized construction. Then came the morning she thought was her moment of triumph. She'd somehow convinced herself that the zoning authorities were finally coming to shut me down. She'd been making calls to various government offices, demanding action on her complaints, and had apparently misunderstood something someone had told her about a scheduled inspection. In reality, the officials arriving that morning were there for an entirely different purpose: the first scheduled inspection of our progress by the Department of Homeland Security. This was a routine check to ensure that the training facility was being built according to federal specifications and security requirements. As I watched Brenda strut around my driveway in her leopard print ensemble, checking her phone and adjusting her clipboard, 3 black Suburbans turned onto our street. Her eyes lit up like Christmas morning, and she practically bounced on her toes with excitement. "Here they come," she announced gleefully to no one in particular. "I hope you have a good lawyer, Mr. Peterson." I had to admit, the timing was perfect. If I'd scripted this confrontation myself, I couldn't have done better. Brenda was about to learn that her assumptions about my project were not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. Chapter 6, The federal response. The vehicles pulled up with the quiet precision of a military convoy, and outstepped 6 individuals in dark suits and sunglasses. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of federal agents, not the casual authority of local zoning officials. Their vehicles bore government plates, and each agent wore an earpiece that marked them as serious law enforcement professionals. Brenda's triumphant expression began to waver as she noticed details that didn't match her expectations. These weren't the local bureaucrats she'd been expecting. These were federal agents who looked like they meant business, and they were looking directly at her with the kind of attention that suggested she was now the subject of their investigation. "Ma'am," the lead agent addressed Brenda, "I'm Agent Sarah Coleman with the Department of Homeland Security. Are you the property owner?" Agent Coleman was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of dealing with genuine security threats. She looked like someone who'd seen real danger and had no patience for suburban melodrama. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Her leopard print clipboard suddenly seemed less like a symbol of authority and more like a child's toy. "And no," she finally managed to stammer. "I'm Brenda Hutchinson, HOA president. I'm the one who filed the complaints about this illegal construction." Agent Coleman's expression didn't change, but I caught the slightest raise of her eyebrow. In my military experience, that subtle reaction meant someone had just said something very interesting, probably for the wrong reasons. "Complaints?" Agent Coleman repeated slowly. "What complaints exactly?" Suddenly emboldened by what she assumed was official interest in her cause, Brenda launched into her well-rehearsed spiel. "This man is building an unauthorized structure in violation of county codes and HOA bylaws. I have documentation of everything: photos, timestamps, witness statements. I've been monitoring this illegal activity for weeks." She thrust her leopard print folder at Agent Coleman with the confidence of someone presenting evidence to a grand jury. The agent took the folder with the same enthusiasm one might show for a used tissue, scanning through Brenda's collected evidence with professional detachment. "I see," Agent Coleman said slowly, her voice carrying a tone that suggested she was seeing far more than Brenda realized. "And how exactly did you obtain this documentation?" "I took photos," Brenda declared proudly, puffing up like a peacock. "Lots of them. I've been conducting surveillance on this illegal activity for weeks. I even bought a drone to get better aerial shots, though it unfortunately malfunctioned." Agent Coleman exchanged glances with her colleagues, and I could see the subtle communication that passes between experienced law enforcement professionals. They were clearly re-evaluating the situation and reaching conclusions that would not be favorable to Brenda. "Ma'am," Agent Coleman said with deadly calm, "I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning." The color drained from Brenda's face as if someone had pulled a plug. "Questioning? But I'm the one who reported this illegal construction. I'm the victim here." "Yes," Agent Coleman replied with a slight smile that held no warmth. "That's exactly the problem." Chapter 7, The Revelation. As it turned out, Brenda's zealous investigation had accidentally photographed and publicly shared details about a classified government project. Her Facebook group had been discussing security features that were meant to remain confidential. Her complaints to various agencies had triggered a federal security review, not of me, but of her. The Department of Homeland Security had been monitoring her Facebook group for 2 weeks, documenting her posts and tracking the spread of sensitive information. Her drone flights over my property had been recorded by federal surveillance equipment, and her trespassing to take photographs had been caught on security cameras that she'd never noticed. Inside my house, which had suddenly become an impromptu command center, Agent Coleman laid out the situation with the professional precision of a military briefing. "Mr. Peterson's renovation is part of a federal initiative to create discrete training facilities for emergency responders. Everything has been properly permitted through appropriate federal channels and is being conducted in full compliance with all applicable laws and regulations." She turned to Brenda, who was sitting in my living room looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the imperious HOA president who'd been terrorizing the neighborhood for years. In her place sat a frightened woman who was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. However, Agent Coleman continued, "Mrs. Hutchinson's interference has created a serious security concern. Her surveillance activities, photography, and public sharing of information have potentially compromised operational security for a facility that trains first responders for disaster scenarios." "I didn't know," Brenda whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's exactly the point," Agent Coleman responded firmly. "You weren't supposed to know. These facilities are kept low profile for very good reasons. Your actions have potentially compromised operational security and exposed sensitive information about federal emergency response capabilities." Over the next 2 hours, Brenda was questioned about everyone she had spoken to, every photo she had shared, every complaint she had filed. The agents were thorough and professional, but their questions made it clear that Brenda's activities had crossed several lines from nuisance into potential federal crimes. The agents confiscated her phone, her camera, her laptop, and even her beloved leopard print folder. They made copies of everything in her possession related to my property, including her handwritten surveillance logs and the printed photos she'd been collecting. She was required to sign a stack of documents, including a non-disclosure agreement and a stern warning about interfering with government operations. The agents made it clear that any future surveillance or interference would result in federal charges that could include obstruction of justice and interference with national security operations. But the federal agents were just the beginning of Brenda's troubles. Word spread quickly through Maplewood Heights about what had really been happening in my barn, and the reaction was swift and decisive. Chapter 8, The Fall of the Tyrant. The special emergency HOA meeting that evening was supposed to be Brenda's victory lap. She'd been planning it for weeks, envisioning the moment when she would present evidence of my violations to a cheering crowd of neighbors. Instead, it became her professional execution. Tom Williams, the vice president, called the meeting to order in Brenda's absence. She arrived 15 minutes late, escorted by her husband Frank, who looked like he'd aged 5 years in a single day. The usual 40 attendees had swelled to over 100. Everyone wanted to witness the fall of the tyrant, and word had spread throughout the neighborhood that this would be a meeting to remember. "Before we begin," Tom announced, his voice carrying an authority that had been missing from previous meetings, "I've been informed by federal authorities that we need to discuss the serious breach of security caused by our president's actions." Brenda tried to speak, but Tom held up his hand and continued. "Not only did Mrs. Hutchinson's behavior trigger a federal investigation, but her trespassing, harassment, and interference with a legitimate government operation have exposed our HOA to significant legal liability." The association's lawyer, a nervous man named David Park who'd been dealing with Brenda's complaints for months, stood up with a thick folder of documents. "The potential lawsuits from this incident could bankrupt our HOA," he announced grimly. "We're looking at possible charges of trespassing, harassment, interference with government operations, violation of federal security protocols, and defamation. The legal costs alone could exceed our annual budget." The room erupted in angry voices. Homeowners who had suffered under Brenda's reign for years finally had their moment to speak truth to power. The stories came pouring out like water from a broken dam. Margaret Foster, the grandmother who'd been bullied into delivering Brenda's messages, stood up with tears in her eyes. "I was fined $300 for having my garbage cans visible from the street for 10 minutes, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. 10 minutes. I had to choose between paying that fine and buying my granddaughter's birthday present." Robert Lang, a retired mechanic who'd been fighting Brenda for 2 years, described being threatened with legal action for painting his shed the wrong shade of beige. "She made me repaint it 3 times, he said angrily. 3 times. And each time she said it still wasn't right. I spent $800 on paint for a shed that was perfectly fine to begin with." The stories continued for over an hour. Carol Peterson, no relation to me, had been fined for having the wrong style of mailbox. The Johnsons had been threatened with legal action for planting roses in their front yard without architectural committee approval. The Gwynns had been harassed for having a vegetable garden that was allegedly incompatible with the neighborhood aesthetic. Each story painted a picture of a woman who had abused her position to terrorize innocent homeowners, extracting money through frivolous fines and using the threat of legal action to control her neighbors' behavior. The pattern was clear: Brenda had been operating a protection racket disguised as homeowners association governance. When the vote came to remove Brenda from her position, it was unanimous except for one vote, Brenda's own. She was also banned from holding any HOA position for life and prohibited from serving on any committee. The final insult came when Tom announced that she was prohibited from coming within 100 feet of my property, effectively making her a prisoner in her own neighborhood. Chapter 9, The Consequences. But the consequences didn't stop at the HOA level. Brenda's employer, Henderson Real Estate, where she worked as an office manager, caught wind of the federal investigation through local news coverage. The story had finally made it to Channel 7, but not as the vindication story Brenda had hoped for. Instead, it was a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the dangers of neighborhood vigilante justice. The real estate firm couldn't afford to have someone who had been formally warned by the Department of Homeland Security handling sensitive client information. Real estate transactions involve detailed property records, financial information, and legal documents that require the highest level of discretion and professionalism. By the following Monday, Brenda was unemployed. Her termination letter cited behavior incompatible with the professional standards expected of our organization and actions that have brought negative attention to the company. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that her obsession with property violations had cost her a job in the property business. The legal fees from fighting the various charges and defending against my countersuit for harassment quickly drained the Hutchinson family's savings. I'd filed a civil suit seeking damages for the harassment, trespassing, defamation, and interference with my legitimate business activities. My lawyer, a former military attorney who understood federal security protocols, had built an airtight case using Brenda's own documentation against her. The countersuit sought compensatory damages for the delays and additional security measures required due to her interference, punitive damages for the harassment and trespassing, and attorney fees for defending against her baseless complaints. The total amount requested was $75,000, which represented both actual damages and a strong message about the consequences of HOA abuse. Frank Hutchinson, Brenda's husband, was a quiet man who'd worked as an insurance adjuster for 20 years. He'd tried to stay out of his wife's HOA activities, but now he was facing the financial consequences of her actions. The legal fees alone were approaching $15,000, and the potential judgment could force them into bankruptcy. The final humiliation came when their homeowner's insurance company reviewed the case and determined that Brenda's actions were intentional and malicious, excluding them from coverage for any damages awarded in the lawsuit. They were completely on their own, facing the possibility of losing their home because of Brenda's obsession with controlling mine. Chapter 10, The Training Facility. The barn renovation was completed without further incident, though the security requirements had been significantly upgraded due to Brenda's breach. What had originally been designed as a low-profile training facility now required enhanced security measures, including additional surveillance equipment, access controls, and screening procedures for all personnel. From the outside, it still looked like any other restored barn, painted traditional red with white trim that actually did complement the neighborhood's aesthetic. But inside, it was a state-of-the-art training facility where first responders practiced everything from building collapse scenarios to hazardous material situations. The facility included multiple training modules, a mock apartment building for practicing urban rescue scenarios, a simulated chemical spill area for hazmat training, a medical emergency simulation room with realistic mannequins, and a command center where incident commanders could practice coordinating multi-agency responses. The Department of Homeland Security had not only commended me for my patience during the security breach but had also fast-tracked additional funding for the facility. The Peterson Regional Emergency Response Training Facility had become a model for similar installations across the country, and delegations from other states were regularly visiting to study our design and training protocols. There was even a small bronze plaque by the door, though you'd have to know where to look to find it. The plaque read, "Peterson Regional Emergency Response Training Facility, dedicated to the brave men and women who run toward danger when others run away." The facility's first major test came during a regional disaster drill that simulated a major earthquake affecting the entire metro area. Fire departments, police agencies, EMS services, and emergency management coordinators from 6 counties participated in the exercise. The training scenarios we'd built proved their worth as responders practiced coordinating their efforts in realistic, high-stress situations. Local news coverage of the drill was extensive and positive, highlighting the facility's role in improving regional emergency preparedness. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Brenda's efforts to shut down the project had actually resulted in enhanced security and funding that made it an even more valuable asset to the community. Chapter 11, The Community Workshop. The best part came 3 months later when we held our first Community Emergency Preparedness Workshop. The Department of Homeland Security had approved a public outreach program that would teach basic disaster response skills to local residents. The workshop covered topics like family emergency planning, basic first aid, emergency communication, and community response coordination. The invitation list included every household in Maplewood Heights, every household except one. Brenda and Frank Hutchinson were specifically excluded due to the security concerns raised by her previous actions. The federal agents had made it clear that her access to any information about the facility was permanently revoked. The workshop was incredibly successful, with over 150 residents attending over the course of 3 days. Participants learned how to prepare emergency supply kits, develop family communication plans, and coordinate with neighbors during disasters. The hands-on training included basic first aid, fire safety, and how to assist professional responders during emergencies. Many of the same neighbors who had been terrorized by Brenda's HOA enforcement were now working together to improve community safety and preparedness. Margaret Foster, who had been fined for her garbage cans, became certified in CPR and first aid. Robert Lang, who had been harassed about his shed color, volunteered to coordinate neighborhood emergency communication. The workshop created a sense of community that had been missing from Maplewood Heights for years. People who had been afraid to talk to their neighbors because of Brenda's divisive tactics were now working together on meaningful projects that would benefit everyone. The local fire chief, Captain Rodriguez, Mike's brother, as it turned out, spoke at the workshop's closing ceremony. "This facility represents the best of what communities can achieve when they work together," he said. "The training we receive here will help us save lives and protect property throughout the region. But more importantly, this workshop has shown that ordinary citizens can be extraordinary heroes when they're prepared and organized." Chapter 12, The Reckoning. I still see Brenda occasionally, usually at the grocery store or gas station. She always looks the other way, quickly finishing her business and leaving. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like she owned it now scurries away like a frightened mouse, avoiding eye contact and conversation. Her transformation has been complete and permanent. The imperious HOA president who once dominated neighborhood meetings and terrorized homeowners with frivolous fines has been replaced by a broken woman who seems to have shrunk into herself. She drives a different route to avoid passing my property, and she hasn't been seen at any community events since the federal investigation. The final tally of consequences was impressive and comprehensive. Brenda faced federal charges for interfering with government operations, resulting in $5,000 in fines and a permanent restriction from any security-related activities. The trespassing and harassment charges added another $3,000 in fines and court costs. The HOA's legal fees to defend against potential lawsuits topped $20,000, which had to be paid through a special assessment that made every homeowner in the neighborhood acutely aware of the real costs of Brenda's actions. The assessment averaged $400 per household, money that could have been used for actual community improvements instead of cleaning up after her legal disasters. Her real estate license was suspended for 6 months due to the security concerns, and she was required to complete additional training on professional ethics and conduct before it could be reinstated. The licensing board had determined that her actions demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was incompatible with the trust and discretion required in real estate transactions. The civil lawsuit I'd filed was settled out of court for $45,000, which represented a significant portion of the Hutchinson family's assets but avoided the risk of an even larger judgment at trial. The settlement included a permanent injunction preventing Brenda from any further surveillance or interference with my property. Chapter 13, The New Order. The transformation of Maplewood Heights HOA has been remarkable. Tom Williams, who took over as president after Brenda's removal, has implemented a completely different approach to community governance. Instead of looking for violations and collecting fines, the new board focuses on actual community improvements and services. The HOA's first initiative under new leadership was to review and dismiss all pending violation cases that had been initiated by Brenda. Many of these cases involved trivial issues like mailbox colors, garden plant choices, or minor aesthetic preferences that had no real impact.